So I'm going to introduce our speaker, Anthony Waters. He obtained his psychology doctorate from the George Washington University. He has, is that correct, Anthony? Is it just the George Washington University, or did I leave off a bit?
No, you got it. It's the George Washington University.
Okay, sorry about that. I was like, did I copy paste this incorrectly? George Washington University. He has trained and worked extensively at the intersection of public health, the criminal legal system, and behavioral health, including at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, the NYPD, NYC DOHMH, and the New York City jail system. Dr. Waters presents and trains widely on topics such as trauma-informed care, verbal de-escalation, and the diagnosis of mental disorders. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Anthony. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yeah, and I would say good evening to everybody, but not everybody's on the East Coast, including myself. I'm actually coming to you all from Portland, Oregon as well. And so I saw somebody else in the chat box indicate that they're out here in Portland. So welcome to everyone. It is incredible to see folks from all over joining, and to see that number of participants tick up over 200 as well. That's just really wonderful. I'd like to thank Clara and NAMI, our host today, as well, for welcoming me to deliver a presentation on suicide prevention. In my work day to day, I provide mental health services in jails and prisons across the country, and suicide prevention is the leading cause of death in jails and the third leading cause of death in prisons. And it's something that we work towards eliminating every day in our work within that setting. And unfortunately, it's where so many people with experiencing mental distress end up in society today. And it's really unfortunate, but it makes suicide prevention a top priority. And I'm so thankful to be welcomed here to share with you all some ways that we together can aim to reduce the number of suicides to zero. So thank you for joining today. And please, as we go along, add questions into that chat box. This is about you all. My aim is to try to make this as informative and educational as possible for you. And so while we're going to be preserving time at the end for questions, please put them in as you think of them. And before we dive into the content, I just want to reiterate something Clara said, which is self-care comes first. Talking about suicide can be traumatizing. It can be re-traumatizing for us. And your self-care is the priority. And so if at any time you need to do something to care for yourself, to step away, to take a deep breath, to get some water, go to the bathroom, give yourself that opportunity to do just that, because it is a weighty topic. And we need to acknowledge when it starts to feel a little bit too much, and do what we need to do for ourselves so that we can feel as much at equilibrium as possible. And our goal here ultimately is to help people stay safe. It's our collective objective. And we all have a role to play in doing just that. And if at any point you are supporting someone who you're concerned is suicidal, but you're starting to feel like maybe it's getting a little bit out of your ability to support or intervene, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll talk about some resources. Of course, the new 988 line being one available resource. And I've got a list of resources in the slide deck that are focused on New York City, but it's so wonderful to see that there are so many folks from other localities as well. And I'm sure you have additional resources there in your local area. And so there's a few objectives that we have for today. The first is to be able to identify some risk factors that put somebody at greater risk for potential suicide. And then we're going to aim to understand how to utilize something called the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. You'll see that abbreviated today as the CSSRS. And we'll talk quite a bit about what that tool is a little later on. And then we'll aim to explain when to pursue certain resources. Again, we've got that list at the end of the slide deck of resources there in New York City, as well as a few national resources. We'll talk about when to utilize those. And we're going to do that across 4 sections. The first is going to be an introduction to gatekeeper training. That's what we're calling this, gatekeeper training. The second is going to be a review of the terminology, the words that we use to talk about suicide, suicide attempts, and so forth, as well as a review of the warning signs, risk factors, and protective factors. Then part 3 is going to be the time when we go into utilization of the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And then part 4 is going to be what we do when somebody is at risk for suicide. So those are the 4 parts of our presentation today. It's a lot to get through in a relatively brief amount of time. And so at some points we'll be moving relatively quickly, but if you need additional clarification on something, again, put it in that chat box. So I always like to start with some questions.
Sorry, I just want to add one quick thing for Spanish speakers. Also, please feel free, and I know this is being interpreted, to put Spanish questions in the chat as well, and I will translate those back for Anthony.
Thank you. Go ahead and add to the chat box whether or not you know the warning signs when somebody is at risk for suicide. You can put a yes, a no, a maybe. I'm not sure. But go ahead and enter into the chat box whether or not you know the warning signs when somebody is at risk for suicide.
So I think the overwhelming, so there's some yeses, some no's, but I would say the majority of folks that I'm seeing here are saying some or not sure. So
yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of sums, a lot of yeses as well, some no's, but definitely, yeah, a lot of it depends or some.
I really appreciate folks acknowledging that they're unsure. And, you know, it's important to acknowledge that everybody's risk factors are going to be a little bit different, right? The things that trigger me are going to be different than the things that trigger you. And so we're going to talk about those risk factors that we know to be that are known from research. So those evidence-based risk factors, but everybody is different. And there are things that will trigger people to feel suicidal that are not in those evidence-based risk factors. And there are folks who are exposed to those evidence-based risk factors that won't feel suicidal in response to experiencing them. So it's different for everybody. Let's ask another poll question. I'm comfortable asking someone if they're having suicidal thoughts. And then go ahead and put a yes, no, or not sure in that chat box again.
So I see a lot of yeses, but a couple of pretty emphatic no, nope, no, depends, maybe or depends. But I see a lot of yeses.
Okay,
I see one person, yes, if they have a plan. So folks are familiar with those questions.
Well, it's wonderful to see a lot of yeses, and I appreciate those folks who are acknowledging that no, they're not comfortable. And I'll say too, I'm a psychologist. That means 4 years of undergrad, 5 years of grad school, got the student debt to prove it, and I am not always comfortable asking those questions. And sometimes it's more about asking them even when we're uncomfortable than it is about feeling comfortable with it. We got to confront that uncomfortable feeling sometimes and proceed even when we are uncomfortable. And so practicing asking these questions is a great way to build comfort. But even when we're uncomfortable, still being able to ask about suicide is so important. And hopefully at the end of today, we'll all feel a little bit more comfortable. Okay, so we're going to get into gatekeeper training now. So first, let's answer the question of what is gatekeeper training? Well, it's about promoting the ability for anybody to identify people at risk for death by suicide and to respond appropriately by helping them access needed services. So identification and responding. Identification and responding. So it's like CPR. I'm not a medical professional. I'm a healthcare professional as a psychologist, but I don't practice medicine, yet I'm CPR trained. And, so many people, teachers, bus drivers, MTA workers, people across different professions get CPR training because there's a belief that we all share a responsibility to respond when somebody is having a cardiac event, and that we can identify when people are having a cardiac event and that we can respond appropriately to try to preserve their life. And just like we try to create as many gatekeepers to prevent bad outcomes from cardiac events, we need to do the same thing for suicide prevention. And so just like CPR, that we all have a role to play in preventing bad outcomes from heart attacks, we all have a role to play in preventing bad outcomes from suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And we are doing this training today to all become gatekeepers so that we can identify people at risk and respond accordingly. And so a gatekeeper isn't a behavioral health professional necessarily. They're just folks who understand the warning signs and who know what tough questions to ask when they see those warning signs. They're ready to hear tough answers too. Sometimes it's uncomfortable to ask the tough questions, but it can be even more uncomfortable to hear the tough answer. It's also about having standard questions so that when we're inquiring about suicide, we're doing it the same way each time. When we have standard questions that we ask the same way each time, it makes it more likely that we're going to get truthful responses from people. If we're asking the question differently every time, sometimes we might ask it in a way that leads the person to a certain answer. For example, are you having thoughts of suicide? Is going to lead to a different response than something like, you're not thinking of suicide, are you? And so by having a standard script that we follow, it really helps us to be able to stay connected to our goal of getting the most honest response as possible. And so I know we've got somebody who has their hand raised. If you're able to, go ahead and add to the chat box your question, and we'll make sure that we're able to answer it. And Claire, if at any point you want to approach any raised hands differently, please let me know. And so let's go over some assumptions that are held about suicide, and let's talk about whether they are true or false, myths or facts. So once again, return to your chat box and enter into that chat box if you believe it's a myth or a fact that asking about suicide increases risk by putting the thought in their head. Asking about suicide increases risk of suicide.
I see a lot of myths, several of them with capital letters and many exclamation points.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah. That is a long-held myth. Asking about suicide does not make people suicidal. Asking about suicide destigmatizes it. It shows that we're comfortable going to that uncomfortable space. And it helps people feel like they can be honest with us when we show that we're comfortable going there. And so asking about suicide does not increase the risk of suicide.
I do want to just highlight somebody saying, I heard it's a myth, but I still worry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that worry comes from multiple places. One reality, and this is coming from what I've heard people say, and so everybody's going to feel and think differently about it. But I've had people tell me, I worry that it's going to increase the risk of the person acting on their thoughts, and that I'm not going to feel comfortable helping them through it. I've also heard people say that they're worried that if they bring up suicide, that it makes it more likely that they're going to act because now it's out in the open. But that's exactly what we want to do. We want to bring it into the open. We want to make it so that people can feel comfortable acknowledging when they're feeling in really serious distress, so that together we can work our way to a safe resolution. When we don't verbalize it, when we don't use the word suicide, it makes it seem taboo. And it makes people retreat back into the shadows even further. And the more people are alone in their pain, the more they don't feel like they have access to solutions. And we're here to show them that not only is it okay to talk about it, but that there are solutions other than having to resort to acting upon the thoughts. Myth or fact? Most suicide attempts result in death. Myth or fact? Most suicide attempts result in death.
I see quite a lot of myths, some with some exclamation points, and some not sures, or sorry, some with some question marks and then some not sures.
Okay, great. Yeah, this one's a little harder. But for each death by suicide, there are about 9 hospitalizations resulting from suicide attempts and 29 attempts without any form of medical care. So what that means is that people often attempt suicide dozens of times before eventually dying by suicide. It's not always the case, but it is often the case. One thing I want to make sure that we acknowledge, though, is that when we believe somebody is at risk for suicide, that we act, that we don't rely on the data here that tells us, oh, you know what, maybe they're going to attempt suicide, but it's unlikely that they'll die. We don't want to have that perspective. We want to appreciate that any attempt at suicide is serious. Whether it results in death or not, it is serious, and we want to act accordingly. Myth or fact? Men die by suicide more than women.
So I see a lot of facts true, some myths. So there's some disagreement here, but I think the vast majority of folks are saying true or fact.
So the suicide rate for men is 3 times higher than it is for women, but the suicide attempt rate is higher for women. And that relates to the differences in how men versus women typically attempt suicide. Men utilize firearms much more commonly than women, and firearms are more lethal. But again, any suicidal ideation or suicidal behavior has to be appreciated as high risk. One of the things that we look at as professionals is what was the methodology that the person harmed themselves with, and how lethal is that methodology. But for us as and for you all as non-professionals, any suicidal ideation or suicidal behavior is high risk. And one last question, myth or fact? More people in the US are killed by homicide than die by suicide. Myth or fact? More people in the US are killed by homicide than die by suicide.
Oh, I think this is pretty evenly split.
Yeah, this is a hard one.
A couple people
However,
saying, I just don't, a bunch of people saying, I don't know. Yeah, but it seems to be pretty evenly split.
And I think that's because we hear in the media so much more about homicide than we do suicide. However, the suicide in the US is more than double the homicide rate, more than double. So over 13 people per 100,000 died by suicide, and between 6 and 7 per 100,000 died by homicide. And so we've got some statistics on this slide. In the interest of time, we're not going to go through each of them, but for those of you who are in New York City, Citi Field, I think, can seat about 42,000 people. That's where the Mets play baseball. Yet for the last year for which we have data, over 46,000 people in the United States died by suicide. Over 46,000. I grew up in a town of 20,000 in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And to think that every year more than twice the population of my hometown die by suicide is just astounding. We're talking, and it's a preventable death. A preventable death. Go ahead and enter into the chat box. What's some stigmatizing statements you've heard people say regarding those who experience suicidal thoughts or who die by suicide? We talked about the importance of destigmatizing conversation around suicide, being able to ask directly about suicide so that people feel like it's not taboo. Yet in our society, experiencing mental distress or disorder is still stigmatized. People use very different words to talk about somebody experiencing cancer than somebody experiencing a mental disorder or experiencing suicidal ideation.
There's a couple of things that are coming up kind of repeatedly. Weak is a one that's being, that many people are saying, selfish, ungrateful. Those are, I think, some of the stigmatizing statements that people are mentioning. Someone mentioned the idea that if you have these thoughts, you're too far gone. There's nothing to do that will help. Someone said attention seeking. And then conversely, why didn't they say something? Yeah, or sort of over dramatic or unstable, that it's only talk. Débil, yeah, so weak. Yeah, or sort of thoughtless to loved ones. They do it for attention without thinking about others, or emotionally weak, get over it. Attention seeking has come up a couple of times, or that they didn't care about others in their lives.
And thank you for sharing all of that, Claire.
Yeah.
It really illustrates just how differently people think about mental distress and disorder than physical distress and disorder, as if there is this duality between the brain and the body, when in reality there is not. And that's why I'm so thankful for organizations like NAMI that work so hard to destigmatize mental distress, bring it into our public discourse so that we can talk about it openly, honestly, and without judgment, which is how we approach suicidal inquiries, openly, honestly, and without judgment, so that people don't feel like they're being viewed as weak, as unstable, as selfish, but instead are being viewed as brave for being open with us about what they're experiencing, for having the courage to acknowledge that they're under distress and need support. It takes so much just strength to be vulnerable like that. And that's the conversation that we need to be having, rather than all of the conversations that instead stigmatize people for experiencing mental distress, disorder, and suicidal thoughts. So let's get into some review of terminology, warning signs, risk factors, and protective factors. So we're going to quickly just go over some of the terminology that we want to use, so that we're all talking about this with the same dictionary. And the first is that when we talk about suicide, we say death by suicide. We often hear people say they committed suicide. And that's in and of itself very stigmatizing. It suggests criminal behavior. They committed an act. No, suicide is not a crime, first and foremost. It was decriminalized back in the 70s, and it's the response to somebody's pain. And so when we talk about suicide, we talk about somebody having died by suicide. And a suicide attempt is any self-injurious act where there was even a tiny bit of intent to die. And that definition is such because oftentimes when people attempt suicide or die by suicide even, it's not that they unequivocally want to die, but part of them wants to die. And that's why even when people are ambiguous, that we have to appreciate the risk, even in that ambiguity. Well, I'm not sure if I want to die. Well, I think maybe a part of me wanted to die. And that's often what we learn when we talk to people who are experiencing suicidal ideation or have attempted suicide, that it was a part of them that wanted to die, not the whole part. But if there's any intent to die through their act, then we do consider it a suicide attempt. But not everybody who engages in a self-harm behavior intends to die. And so in those instances, we talk about non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. And there's lots of reasons why people may self-harm without the intent to die. For some people, they may feel numb, and it's a way to connect to their body. For some people, the physical pain can be more tolerable than the emotional pain. There are any number of reasons why people may engage in non-suicidal self-injury, but we differentiate that from suicide attempts. And then when we talk about an interrupted attempt, that's a suicide attempt that was stopped by somebody else, versus an aborted attempt, which is a suicide attempt that was stopped by the individual themselves. I mentioned the concept of lethality before. When somebody attempts suicide with a firearm, that's highly lethal. Somebody may attempt suicide thinking that a handful of Tylenol will end their life. That's low lethality. And then we talk about preparatory behavior. Preparatory behavior are any actions aimed at gathering the means necessary to die by suicide. Maybe it's somebody attempting to purchase a firearm, or somebody trying to secure the pills that they need to die by suicide. Preparatory behavior can also involve things like trying to get the family out of the house. Anything aimed at getting the means necessary to die by suicide. So just in the interest of time, you don't have to enter anything into the chat box here, but think about the kinds of preparatory behaviors that maybe you've seen in loved ones, friends, family, that you've helped through or want to be able to help through experiencing suicidal ideation. And just take a minute to think about it, and in a moment we'll go on to the next slide. Okay. We're going to show some preparatory behaviors a little later on here, but let's go on and talk about risk factors and protective factors. So risk factors are the things that increase the likelihood that somebody will experience suicidal ideation or behavior, ideation just being suicidal thoughts. And protective factors are the things that decrease the likelihood. So a risk factor could be something like conflict in a relationship. A protective factor could be something like a really strong relationship that offers a lot of support. So you can see that the same thing, a relationship, can either increase risk or decrease risk depending on the status of that relationship at any given time. But a risk factor, again, is something that increases risk, and a protective factor is something that decreases it. And we like to think about both. What are the things that place this person at risk, but what are the things that also offer some protection? Because when we talk about intervening with people who are at risk for suicide, it's those protective factors that we really want to bolster. We'll come back to that later on. So on this slide, we've got risk factors and protective factors. Risk factors like a history of suicide attempts, recent loss. A family history of suicide increases risk for somebody dying by suicide. And if we notice things like a change in routine or housing instability, relationship instability, these are all things that increase possible risk for suicide. Protective factors are things like having a positive outlook on the future, positive relationships with peers or family, coping skills that are effective at managing distress. So moving on from risk factors into warning signs. Warning signs are the thoughts, behaviors, or emotions that suggest someone is at immediate risk of self-injury. This is where we're going to identify some of that preparatory behavior that I referenced before. So we're going to break warning signs down into thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. Thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. And keep in mind that what we have up on these slides is in no way intended to cover all the possible warning signs, but just to give you a sample of those warning signs that we know to be evidence-based or that we hear commonly from patients who have experienced suicidal thoughts or behaviors. Direct statements are things like, I want to die. I wish I was dead. Life isn't worth living. I should just kill myself. Where it's pretty clear that this person is likely having thoughts of suicide. Indirect statements are more ambiguous. It's a bit harder to draw the connection to suicide, but this is where we really have to have our antenna up. I can't do this. I'm so tired. No one cares. It'd be easier if I was just invisible. The kinds of statements where you're not hearing death, suicide, kill myself, end it all. But there's things that suggest under the current or under the surface, there may be having those thoughts. Direct statements and indirect statements. And then there's direct behaviors and indirect behaviors. Those direct behaviors are that represents that preparatory behavior. Things like buying a weapon, hoarding medication, Googling how to kill yourself, giving property away, filing a will, saying goodbye, reaching out to people from the past. The kinds of things that people might feel they need to do to close the loop on their life, either through filing a will or saying goodbye, or engaging in those actions that are necessary to acquire the means to end one's life. But then there's also indirect behaviors, things, once again, that aren't connected directly to the act, but increase the risk, like becoming isolated or withdrawn, or acting with unusual hostility or aggressiveness, or not engaging in previously enjoyed activities, or maybe using substances more or differently, or engaging in high-risk behaviors. High-risk behaviors can be things like driving recklessly, driving without a seatbelt, drinking and driving, engaging in unprotected sexual behavior. Anything that places the person at higher risk for harm from those actions can be an indirect sign that they're feeling suicidal as well. And then emotional warning signs. Anger, depression, agitation, mood fluctuation, going from irritable to content to agitated to tearful over a shorter period of time. Shame and guilt are known high-risk factors as well. So we've talked about risk factors, we've talked about warning signs, we've identified some of the protective factors. We're going to show about a 4.5-minute video here. And as you're watching the video, go ahead and just enter into the chat box any risk factor, warning sign, or protective factor that you see. This man is reading his suicide note that he turned into a poem. And I want to note before we watch the video that it is really emotional. I've seen this at least a dozen times, and I'm brought to the edge of tears every time I watch it. So if you need to step away at any point, it's okay. If you want to shed a tear, that's okay too. And as you're watching, if you can, identify the risk factors, warning signs, and protective factors that this man experienced.
All right, everybody, welcome to your Rust Belt Poetry Slam. Next up to the stage, we got Akeem Rollins.
Suicide note. Tell my nephew I am sorry. Tell my sister I'm sorry she had to be the one to tell my nephew. Tell her I was afraid of her judgment. Tell my mother.
Okay, hold up. Before we get any further, I just want to make sure you understand that, yes, I actually wrote this as my suicide note. But let me back up a little bit. I grew up in the ghetto on the east side of Cleveland. I'm that kid over there, the really skinny bookworm type. I wrote poems, a lot of them, and I got picked on all the time. I got kicked out of my house when I was 14 because I told my mother I was gay.
Get out of my house.
I was homeless and just trying to survive. I was broke, hungry, and then there was depression. And let me tell you, it was bad. I finally got to the point where I just said, I'm done. So that's where the suicide note comes in.
Tell my mother I wasn't bluffing. Tell my grandmother to please open up the gates. I know this really wasn't the way she expected to see me again, but this is how I am unraveled. Tell her, never mind, I'll tell her myself. Tell my other suicide notes they asses weren't poems either. Tell my roommate I'm sorry he had to be the one to find the body. Tell the blood, be quick about it already. Tell Ryan, my love, that everything has his name on it. Tell the downstairs neighbors I'm sorry for the thud. Tell the pain I said goodbye. Tell goodbye I said hello. Tell depression, good game, I almost had you, mother. Tell the psychiatrist the medicine ain't working. But don't tell my little brother, don't tell Rashad unless he asks. Please.
See? It was bad.
Hello.
But before I actually tried anything, I called a friend to say goodbye. And she called the police. They took me to the hospital. I was pissed. And I kept writing.
Tell the nurse, don't smile and hold my hand. Don't tell me I can heal. Don't lie to me now. Don't you show me what I got to live for. Don't make me want this again. Please don't make me fight. I'm tired. No, I don't want it to be better. Don't fix the brokenness. That is all that I know.
So, yeah, I wasn't having it. I didn't even want to try. But then I met a nurse named Renee. And she was the first person who took the time to really listen.
Yeah, that's the only way to describe it.
We talked for hours. And at some point I realized I didn't actually want to kill myself. I started to think of my life like one of the stories I put in my poems. But my story was still at the beginning. And I wanted to know how it ends. So when I got out of the hospital, I picked my notebook back up again, and I turned my suicide note into this poem.
Tell Renee, tell Nurse Renee. Tell Renee I said thanks. Tell her I said thank you. Tell my nephew, tell them all I said thank you. Tell God I said send another one every day. Tell Chocolate I said thank you. Tell Greek Yogurt I'm back. Tell them I am home. Tell them I'm home. Home is here. No matter what the shatter or the clatter, I am here. I am so present. Tell God, whoever he or she or they are, thanks. But next time, I won't be seeing them soon.
Part of what's so moving for me in that video is how beautifully it illustrates hope. That even in that period where he was feeling so bleak and hopeless, he reached out to a friend, and that friend was the gatekeeper that helped him access support. Now you could hear in his voice, he wasn't happy about going to the hospital. And it was a pretty bad experience at first until he felt listened to. And that's what we're trying to do today, is build our capacity to be that gatekeeper, to recognize the risk factor and warning sign and ask the tough questions, and then to be prepared to listen to the tough answers and show that support. So Clara, do we have any comments in the chat box with risk factors, warning signs, or protective factors?
Yeah, we have a lot of comments. Thank you, everybody. So a couple people brought up the family support as a risk factor. Somebody brought up that he said, "I'm tired. I'm just exhausted." Somebody mentioned LGBTQ status as a risk factor, which I know you hadn't mentioned, but is brought up here. Yeah, just sort of a couple, somebody else mentioned just isolation and hopelessness. And then the protective factor being felt listened to, which you also highlighted. Yeah, for one person to make him feel valued.
That's great.
Yeah, so he stated he didn't want to fight anymore. I couldn't do it anymore. Loss of hope. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Kudos to the individual who identified the indirect statement of, "I'm just so tired." It's a great example of indirect statement. So sometimes, remember, we'll hear the direct statement, "I should just kill myself," or "I want to die." But sometimes it's those indirect statements like, "I'm just so tired." Yeah, so it's a wonderful job identifying those risk factors and warning signs, and also protective factors. So let's get into actually screening for suicide risk. So let's all embrace this basic assumption that if something your loved one did or said made you think about their risk for suicide, assume they've thought about it as well. That's that gut feeling, right? Sometimes that's all it takes. We maybe can't even identify exactly what it was that they did or said that made us suddenly think about suicide. But if we have that gut feeling, act on it and assume that they've thought about it as well. Because again, suicide is preventable, and it starts with us asking about it. And so anytime you have that gut feeling, or you notice a warning sign or risk factor, that's the time to conduct a suicide inquiry. And in doing so, we want to be direct by using the word suicide. And we're going to talk about some very specific questions to ask and practice those questions. The more uncomfortable you are asking them of your loved one, the more they're going to pick up on that discomfort, and the more likely that they're going to feel inclined to hide their honest experience. I've got up here, avoid being judgmental. We're humans. We're incredibly good at being judgmental. It comes naturally to us. And so really what that should say is try to be as minimally judgmental as possible. Minimize judgments. Being non-judgmental is like trying to be perfect. We can never be perfect, but we can minimize our judgments, and we can recognize when they might be creeping in and try to dial them back. And something that's so important is thank the person for being honest. If they acknowledge that they're feeling suicidal, let them know how much you appreciate that they're willing to be that vulnerable with you. Because that right away shows that they are strong in their willingness to be vulnerable. And as soon as you start to tap into strengths, you start to remind them of their own resilience as well. And avoid leading statements. I referenced those before. Those are a leading statement is asking about suicide in a way that prompts them to respond in a certain way, such as, you wouldn't actually do anything to harm yourself, right? You don't actually want to die, do you? You're not going to do something stupid, right? All of those questions are asked in such a way that they're leading the person to say, no, they're not feeling suicide. And so when we think about a suicide inquiry, the different components, we think about thoughts, plan, intent, behavior, and means. Is the person thinking about suicide, thinking about death? Or do they have a plan of how they would kill themselves? Do they intend to act on that plan? Are they engaging in the behavior, or are they, do they have the way to engage in the behavior? And do they have the means, the access to the way they would act on it? Thoughts, plan, intent, behavior, and means. It's a lot to keep in mind. However, the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale gives us 6 questions we can ask that cover all of that. And it has been researched in pretty much every setting possible and shown to be a valid way to identify people who are at risk for suicide. And it's intended to be used by anybody: friends, family, teachers, bus drivers, anybody. Behavioral health professionals use them, nurses use them, physicians use them, but it's not exclusive to healthcare. It is used across settings. And these are the 6 questions of the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. I'm going to read them aloud now. All of these questions, this scale is available online as well. It's really easy to access. I'm going to show you how you can get these questions on your phone via an app as well. But for now, I'm just going to read through them. Have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? Have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself? Have you thought about how you might do this? Have you had any intention of acting on those thoughts? Have you started to work out how you would kill yourself? Did you intend to carry out that plan? Have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? So that took 33 seconds. 33 seconds to save a life. That's pretty incredible. And it's really those first 2 questions that are the most important. And if they answered no to those first 2 questions, then going on to the 6th. So let's just look at how long it takes to ask those 3. Have you wished you were dead or that you could go to sleep and not wake up? Have you had any thoughts actually about killing yourself? Have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? 13 seconds. 13 seconds. And so when we think about the implications of asking these questions, the possibility of being able to get somebody the help that they need in 13 to 33 seconds is just incredible. And so let's look at these 6 questions and how they map out to thoughts, plan, intent, behavior, and means. Have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? That's getting to whether or not they've had thoughts of suicide, suicidal ideation. Same with that second question. Have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself? Same with that third question. Have you thought about how you might do it? But that also begins to tap into plan, whether or not they have a plan of how they would attempt suicide. This fourth question gets to intent. Have you had any intention of acting on these thoughts? As opposed to having the thoughts, but not acting on them. And this fifth question gets to plan and intent. Have you started to work out the details of how to kill yourself? Did you intend to carry out that plan? And then this last question gets to behavior and means. Have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? So take 30 seconds, and if you're comfortable doing so, read those 6 questions out loud to yourself now. Take 30 seconds and read those questions out loud to yourself now. It can sound kind of weird reading a script like this. I can promise you that the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. The first time you read through it, you might stumble a little bit. You might sound kind of robotic. Have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? But then the more you go through it, you'll find just how naturally you can integrate it into a conversation with someone who you're worried is at risk. And you might just find yourself saying, have you wished you were dead or that you could go to sleep and not wake up? The more you practice it, the more natural it will sound. Have you actually had any thoughts of wanting to kill yourself? And there's also some great examples, if you just Google YouTube, administration of the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, where you can see this administered in a really natural way that flows so comfortably. But I would encourage you, practice. And even if you just take 30 seconds a day over the rest of the week, that means you'll have practiced it a half dozen times. And I bet by the start of next week, you'll feel much more comfortable asking these questions. So available in the Android App Store and the Apple App Store is an app that walks you through these questions. I have it on my phone. It's called the Columbia Protocol, and I encourage everybody to download it. And it's so user-friendly. It walks you through those questions so that you don't have to have them memorized if maybe that's difficult for you. And based on your answers, it helps you know what to do. It tells you if the person is low risk, moderate risk, or imminent risk, which means high risk. And so again, it's called the Columbia Protocol. And you can see the sort of symbol in the top left of the screenshots there, and that's what the icon looks like in the App Store. But I know the 6 questions, but even as a psychologist, even knowing it, and even having conducted this hundreds of times and having conducted hundreds more what we call risk assessments, I still have the app because I take comfort knowing that it's always on my phone and that I can access it if I need to. And I imagine they've updated the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number now. That's no longer the number now, it's just 988. So I want to take a few minutes and just talk briefly about responding to suicide risk. So the first thing that we want to do, of course, is ask those tough questions and be prepared to hear the tough answers. And when we hear those tough answers that somebody is feeling suicidal, it's important that we don't leave them alone. that we continue to listen and try to listen in as minimally judgmental a way as possible, and to empathize with their experience. Remember, if somebody acknowledges that they're feeling suicidal, they are being just incredibly vulnerable with you. They're exposing themselves to you. And that is such a treasured thing, to hold someone's vulnerability. And so treat that preciously. Thank them for being honest and open with you, and appreciate that they are comfortable feeling vulnerable with you. And the more comfortable you can be with their vulnerability, the better. And then you want to support them through the next steps. And those next steps are getting support, whatever that may be. Maybe they have a therapist they can reach out to, or maybe you call 988 together. Or maybe they have another friend who's helped them through these sorts of tough times that you want to loop in as well. But it's about making sure that you're able to take the steps necessary to make them feel safe. And by the way, things like no harm contracts, they don't work. The evidence has shown that they don't work. Getting someone to sign a piece of paper saying they're not going to harm themselves, it doesn't work. But things that do work are asking, for example, what are the things that you've done in the past that have helped you get through moments like this? How have you kept yourself safe up till now? Are there things that you believe that we can do today that can help you? And, when we ask questions like, what helps you de-stress in moments like this? Or how have you stayed safe in moments like this in the past? What we're doing is we're tapping into their strength. People are incredibly strong. They're survivors. And being able to tap into that just survivalist capability is really important, especially when people are feeling really vulnerable and hopeless. And when we talk about helping people connect, there's connection on the interpersonal level. That's what you're having with the person as they're expressing feeling suicidal. There's connection on the community level to things like healthcare professionals, faith organizations, community groups. There's connections on the societal level, like 988, or in New York City Well, or sometimes you may need to call 911. Or if your loved one is a veteran, there's a veterans crisis line, or the Trevor Project for people who are LGBTQ+. And there's suicide prevention resources specific to people from different cultures, whether it be Spanish-speaking individuals or otherwise. And so knowing what sorts of resources might be best suited to help you or your loved ones is important. NAMI, I mean, my goodness, what a wonderful resource. And so on this slide, we just have a number of possible resources available. Again, the 988 Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I have a link here as well to the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And then again, there's the Columbia Protocol app. But the resources that I have here are in no way all of the resources available to you, your loved ones, and that are accessible within your community. So I encourage you all to know what's available to you, so that when you are asking those tough questions and you're getting those tough responses, that you know where you can turn to for additional support as needed. Okay, so the goal was to leave 20 minutes for questions, and it looks like we hit that mark almost exactly. So we've got about 20 minutes left. I hope this was informative. I know we went really fast, and so I apologize if we skimmed over things a little bit too quickly at certain points, but now's our time to be able to go back and clarify a little bit. And so Clara, if there are questions, let's walk on through.
Amazing. Yeah, we have lots of questions. So one thing that just really quick, since you mentioned 988, And I think this is a good thing for everyone to hear. Someone asked if they can call 988 on behalf of someone else.
Yeah, my understanding is that you absolutely can, and it's about sometimes, like, if you are there with the person, again, what you really want to make sure that you do is that you don't leave the person alone. So if you're with them and maybe they're not comfortable calling, maybe you can call on their behalf, and whatever connects to additional resources in whatever way possible, do it. But don't leave that person alone. So if, for example, you are in a different location from them, then that wouldn't be the time to call 988. That would be the time if you've asked the questions of the Columbia and they've acknowledged suicidality, and maybe you're on the phone. You don't want to get off the phone with them and call 988. That would be the time to take a more emergent response.
Amazing. Great. So kind of going along with that, and I do see Najia, your question. So, and I want to go through some of the questions that have backed up in the chat, and then I do want to hopefully give folks a chance to unmute themselves and ask more detailed questions if we have time. So there were a couple questions about kind of having these conversations. One is, do you have any suggestions for making sure someone is in a safe place to talk if you initiate the conversation by phone? Obviously, we can just ask, is there a way to invite them to share that they're not in a safe place to talk?
Yeah. So the first thing I would do is ask them. So are you someplace where you feel comfortable talking right now? Yeah. And if the answer is no, I would ask if they can go someplace where they feel comfortable talking. And if the answer again is no, then I would say, I'm going to ask you some yes, no questions, and you can just answer yes or no. And you don't have to elaborate on the question, but you can just answer yes or no. And usually, even if somebody is in a setting where they aren't comfortable talking about sort of the details behind their suicidal ideation, they can still answer yes or no. And then it's a matter of being able to take a next step where either they are connecting to somebody else who is in that room with them that can help them stay safe, or you're helping them connect to an outside resource so that they can stay safe without letting them off the phone.
Absolutely. Similarly, you talked about how rather than no harm contracts, the most evidence-based way to proceed is to ask people about their coping skills and really focus on strengths and ways they've coped in the past. Someone said, I work in a youth shelter where children are frequently coming in with zero coping skills, and the protocol is to safety contract. Can you make any suggestions about better questions to ask youth that seem to have no or very few identifiable coping skills?
So thank you for that question, first of all. And I think what happens a lot is people don't know that they have coping skills. It's hard, especially for kids, to be able to articulate how they've gotten through. But the reality is that they've gotten through to this point. So there's been something that they've been able to do that has allowed them to persevere in the face of all that stress and trauma that they've encountered. They might just not know it yet. And so it might take a little bit more exploration. And so maybe if I'm struggling to get to a good answer around what do you do to get through tough times, maybe I'll ask, what do you do to have fun? Or what helps you get your mind off things? Or is there anything that you do or play that you just notice that your mind just gets totally engrossed in that activity? Like for a lot of kids, it's video games, but for some it's art or music. And sometimes asking questions in that way can actually get us to those coping skills that maybe they don't know that they have, because they're really thinking about the word coping skill, and it's such a limited scope in their mind that they don't realize that there are all these other things that they do that actually help them relieve stress. like sports or running or again, music, art, all sorts of things that kids do that maybe bring a smile to their face. And maybe I'll ask that, when was the last time that you laughed? And maybe it's really hard for them to be able to identify that and empathize with that, but maybe they're able to say, a couple of days ago, well, what were you doing at that time? Well, I was hanging out with a friend. What were you guys talking about? Well, it sounds like that helped you feel comfortable and like you were having fun. And that's, now you're starting to get to some ways that they can manage stress. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are some great suggestions. I talked a little bit with the person who put in this question, but I think it's a really interesting one. Why do we, what if somebody lies? What if somebody doesn't answer the questions honestly?
Yeah. So that's difficult. Because there can be, I guess my first response is, how do we know they're lying? And my second response is, why do we think they're lying? And usually what I want to do in those instances is avoid confronting them on what I believe is a lie, and instead focus on what I believe they may be experiencing. So instead of saying something like, gosh, I have a hard time believing that's true, I'll say something like, gosh, it looks like you're in a lot of pain right now. So maybe I'll say, are you having any thoughts of, are you having thoughts of death, or do you wish you could go to sleep and not wake up? And they say no. And we go through some of the other questions, and they continue to say no. And I'll say, boy, I hear that you're not feeling suicidal, but I also see that it looks like you're in a lot of pain right now. And see where that goes. Or I might ask, sometimes people just don't feel comfortable talking about it. And so maybe I'll say, how do you feel about me asking these questions? Thinking that maybe if I can dispel the stigma or the taboo nature of the questions, we can get to how they're really feeling, whether it's suicidal or not. But I guess my point is that there are multiple reasons why somebody may not be forthright with us, and trying to approach the person from a perspective of empathy and minimizing our judgments about their responding is key. If we approach them from the perspective of, you're misleading me, that will put them on the defensive. But we approach them from the perspective of, but gosh, I really see that it looks like you're in a lot of pain right now. That's now approaching them from the perspective of, I want to connect. And so one can lead to greater distance, and the other can lead to greater connection, hopefully, with the person who's perhaps feeling suicidal.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for addressing that. So there are a couple of questions which I think are really important to address about police involvement. If somebody asked, if you've decided the person needs help, they have a plan, that you feel they need hospitalization, are there alternatives to calling 911? If you call for somebody else asked if you're with the person and call for an ambulance, will the police get involved? And somebody else asked, is calling the police the right action for someone who has informed you they're going to commit suicide? So I feel like those are all variations on, a similar set of questions about what happens, about what happens in a crisis.
Yeah,
And
those are wonderful questions, because sometimes calling the police can make us feel less safe. And what we hope for is that we increase safety. And so what I do in those circumstances is, first, it's about knowing what the resources are within your community. For example, out here in Oregon, they're starting mental health response teams that are decoupled from police, where if there's a mental health crisis, they'll send trained de-escalators rather than police to intervene, and you access them through 911. In communities where that doesn't exist, there are still officers oftentimes that are what's called CIT trained, or crisis intervention team trained. And I would try to understand if there are officers within your jurisdiction, within your community, who are CIT trained. And if you need to call 911, then I would specifically ask for a CIT trained officer. And I would also make clear, if you needed to call 911 and you were asking for a medical response, I would ask if they intend to send the police as well, so that you know what to expect. But again, know what the resources are within your community to handle mental health emergencies. Many communities have alternatives. In those communities that do not have alternatives, they often have specialized trained officers, and I would request one of those specially trained officers. In communities where they send EMTs, I would ask if they also intend to send police. So once again, you know what to expect. But if you feel somebody is imminently at risk, I encourage you to take the action necessary to secure their safety in that moment. And it's scary to think about having to call the police. So know the resources in your community. And if that is the best available resource in an emergency situation, sometimes that's what we have to utilize. But ask for that CIT trained officer.
Thank you. And so follow-up question to that. If the police do get involved, is there a risk that the person will be charged or otherwise taken into custody?
Suicide, in suicide attempts, it is non-criminal. That's why we no longer say anything like committed suicide. It is not a crime to attempt or commit suicide. So there's nothing criminal associated with that act. Now, if the police officer believes the person needs to go to the hospital, they can initiate that transfer. So you have to think about that component. But suicidal behavior is not in and of itself a crime.
Thanks. Yeah, hopefully that that helps to kind of address some of that. And it is, I mean, I think as you're getting to, it's really difficult to know what to do in a crisis. And I think my feeling is often that people are the experts in, you're the expert in your own situation and, in your own relationships, which is something that I just like to emphasize. So a couple of questions about sort of ongoing discussions about suicidality, or someone where it's a topic that may come up more frequently. So what if the person says direct statements referencing suicide, but always says they're joking if you discuss the situation if you want to discuss the situation in more depth?
Yeah. So one thing that I always say is that when I see those warning signs, those risk factors, that I'm always going to take them seriously. And that's because I care, and I want people to feel safe. And so even if somebody says they're joking, I will say to them, I have to take it seriously. And it's because I care about you, and I want you to be safe. In situations where this happens repeatedly, I think it's hopefully in that situation, the person is also receiving some sort of additional support, whether it be through a psychotherapist or otherwise. And under those circumstances, there's a lot of value in there being a team approach. and talking with if you're able to, and if it's a family member, especially if it's a child and you're their guardian, that there's a conversation with the therapist about this pattern and how we can all be approaching it from the same perspective, so that we're reinforcing to the person that we care, we want to keep them safe, and that we take this seriously.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's a question about cutting or non-suicidal self-injury, I think more
I'm so sorry.
generally.
Claire, can I go back just real quick?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
The other thing is that sometimes what will happen is somebody will say something, and then we'll start to go a little bit deeper into our questioning, and maybe they're sensing that we're feeling uncomfortable, and they say, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. And so we have to show them that we're okay with this conversation as well. We have to communicate to them that we're okay with this conversation. And I just want to acknowledge that happens sometimes too. That sometimes people who feel so desperate that they're experiencing suicidality, they don't want to burden others. And if they start to feel like they're burdening us, then they'll retreat sometimes. And we want to show them that they don't have to retreat, that we're comfortable with this, and we're okay going deeper with them. So I just wanted to add that piece, Claire. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No. I think that's a really important point. And I think going along with that, which also kind of goes back to the question of honesty, there was a question about cutting and other non-suicidal self-injury. What if the person says that they are not intending to die or to seriously harm themselves, but we suspect that that's not the case? Are there indications that would indicate greater seriousness or a greater sort of intent to self-harm?
So the one thing that we always look at is the lethality of the self-harm. So is the person cutting deep, and are they cutting in a way that could really sever an artery? But these are the kinds of things that really necessitate involvement of a professional to help make that determination. And so hopefully, if your loved one is engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, or what they assert is non-suicidal self-injury, that they're also seeing a professional and trying to encourage conversation between you and that professional when appropriate, to understand what you should be looking for with your loved one in their specific circumstances, can be really helpful. It's so important that treatment, whenever possible, is incorporating family and peers, and it's not just about the treatment provider and the person in treatment, but it's about their system. Remember, I had that slide up with the individual, interpersonal, community, society, the concentric circles. It's about really leveraging all of those systems. And so when possible, having conversations with the treatment team is really valuable, and trying to understand the lethality of the behavior as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Anytime you have concern, act. That's probably the most important message.
Yeah.
Don't try to make a determination that you don't feel comfortable making. Always err on the side of safety.
Going back to the police question, because I think this is hopefully important information for folks to be aware of. So the person said, we called 911 at one point. By the time they came, we decided that it might have made things worse, but the police told us once we call, they have to take the person. Is that true in NYC? If it is not a crime, how can that be true?
Yeah, I've not heard that before. I've heard where they say, well, we've got to talk to the person just to make sure that they're safe, and then making a determination. But I've not heard that, oh, you made a report, we have to take them.
Interesting. Yeah, this may also be a different locations thing. There's somebody else in the chat corroborate saying that this is something that they've also experienced. So I think it may be something that where it's going to be different in different places. And I'm glad that folks are sharing about their experience with that, so that folks can potentially be aware that that's a possibility.
And what I would say is in those locations where you've heard that from police before, I would call the police and I would ask, police have multiple ways of contacting them, and you don't always have to call through 911, but they often have information lines. And I would say, hey, I've heard that in our community, if you call about somebody in mental health crisis, that you have to take them. The reason why that doesn't resonate with me is because if you call and say, I think my husband's having a heart attack, and then the police and EMT show up and it turns out it was just heartburn, they're not gonna force you into the ambulance and take you to the hospital if there's no indication that it was actually a heart attack. And so we always want to be dispelling this brain-body dichotomy that we see. Unfortunately, it's a very real dichotomy that so many others still buy into, and it leads to stigmatization of mental distress and disorder, and treating mental distress and disorder differently than any other medical condition. So I regret that that's been some folks' experience, and I would recommend calling the local police station to understand exactly what their policy is around that.
Yeah, and I just want to add to the person sharing a little bit more about their situation. It sounds really, I'm sorry that happened, because it sounds like it was a very stressful circumstance. So I know we're a little bit past time, but there's one more question that I want to kind of address. And I want to, before I ask this last question, there have been a few questions about losing someone, particularly when there were not warning signs, or it seemed that the person was very much supporting others. And for those people, if you're in the situation of having lost someone, there are definitely resources, particularly bereavement groups, for those who have lost a loved one to suicide. It's that can be a really difficult situation, and there's some resources that I can share for that. But the last question I wanted to ask, because I think it's relevant to a lot of folks, and before I ask it, I also, there was a request to put this resources slide back up just while we're kind of finishing up. Can you talk a little bit about how to handle the risk factor if someone really experiences a chronic suicidal ideation, where they've been someone's been talking about it on and off for years, and it's sort of an ongoing issue?
Yeah, so this goes back to, again, the hope that the person is receiving some treatment and that there can be some coordination with the treatment provider or the treating team. There's wonderful evidence-based treatment programs around suicide prevention and reducing suicide attempts, and that are really successful. And so hopefully trying to help the person access treatment, and then having coordination with the treatment team is really valuable, because that then can help us understand what we can be doing as a coordinated system to help the person. What we want to do, again, it's about the risk factors, but also the protective factors. And when we're talking about protective factors, we're also thinking about the strengths and coping mechanisms that the person has. And so if they're experiencing suicidality over a period of years and it kind of waxes and wanes, we want to understand how at any given time we can increase access to those protective factors and decrease the effect of those risk factors. That's essentially what we're trying to do. When somebody's experiencing it over a long period of time, months or years, we can usually get more insight into the things that they've used successfully in the past to manage through those crisis times. And those are the things we want to try to leverage when they enter back into crisis as well. There's also wonderful resources around things like wellness recovery action plans that are peer-to-peer resources that help individuals experiencing mental disorder or distress build a plan for how they will achieve recovery. And if during their recovery they enter back into crisis, what they can do and the resources they can access to help them get out of crisis. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I know we're 5 minutes over, so unfortunately we are going to have to end there. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to everybody's question. I hope that the information that was shared was helpful to everyone, and really appreciate everybody's questions and comments and responses and everything to all of this information. So thank you all so much for being here. Again, the recording will be sent out to everyone who registered for this event. Thank you so much to our interpreters, both ASL and Spanish. Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Thank you, everybody who shared resources in the chat. Yes, you please feel free to share the recording once you receive it. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thank you for being gatekeepers, everyone.
Thank you.